and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, we will discuss the concept of liability. In tort law, the most important concept which you have to keep in mind is the idea of liability. Now, this liability changes from people to people, from person to person. This liability can be with respect to state, this liability can be vicarious liability. Another aspect of this liability is the rule of strict liability and the rule of absolute liability. Now, rule of strict liability is a English concept. It is a English concept. It was evolved in the landmark case of Ryland versus Fletcher. We will discuss this case in complete depth. Year is around 1868. But the concept of absolute liability is an addition to the idea of strict liability. And in this concept, it was developed by Indian courts. Okay, it is an addition to the idea of strict liability, Indian courts, and the case was MC Mehta versus Union of India. So these are the two cases which have developed the concept of strict liability, Ryland versus Fletcher, and absolute liability, MC Mehta versus Union of India. Okay, now let us discuss what we really mean by strict liability. Okay, see, there can be a situation where a person is not negligent. Okay, he was not negligent, but still some damage happened. He did not had any intention to do any harm, but still some harm happened. Okay, sometimes he may have taken positive efforts to stop that particular harm, okay, to stop that particular wrongful act, but still these situations where the defendant has no fault, okay, he does not have any fault, but still he will be held liable. So these are the situations in which we call them as no fault liability. Okay, so this idea of no fault liability means you do not have any fault. There is no fault on the part of the defendant, but still he has certain liabilities. Okay, this is no fault liability. So these are developed in the cases of Ryland versus Fletcher 1868, and the second case is MC Mehta versus Union of India 1987. So try to remember the year of these cases. Ryland versus Fletcher 1868, MC Mehta 1987. Okay. Now, what we will do in this lecture, we will first understand the rule of strict liability. Then we will understand its essential ingredients. After that, there are certain exceptions to this rule. Okay, we will discuss them one by one. After that, we will move on to the rule of absolute liability. Okay, so the rule of strict liability case is Ryland versus Fletcher. I am reminding you again, the year is 1868. Now, the House of Lords in Ryland versus Fletcher recognized the rule of no fault liability. Okay, so this liability was known as strict liability. Even if the defendant was not having any wrongful act, okay, even if the defendant was not having any negligent act, okay, even if the defendant did not intentionally caused the particular harm, he took proper care, he could still be made liable under this rule. Okay, this is the gist of the rule of strict liability. So even if you do not have done any harm, you can be held liable, no fault liability. Now, this Ryland versus Fletcher, the facts of the case are very important. See, defendant in this case constructed some water reservoir through some independent contractors. Okay, this is clear. He constructed some reservoirs. Now, there were certain old shafts of the plaintiff's mine, which were under the reservoir. When the water was filled in those reservoirs, it busted and it entered into the shafts and flooded the plaintiff's coal mine on the adjoining land. Okay, I hope this is clear. If I explain it with the help of a diagram, so see, this is the property of defendant, this is the property of plaintiff. Now this, he constructed some reservoir. Now it had certain shafts. Now, when water was filled due to the weight of the water, the shafts broke and the water entered into plaintiff's mind, and it led to damages for the plaintiff. Okay. Now, the defendant was not aware of the shafts. Okay. He was also not negligent. Why? Because independent contractors were employed. But the court held that even if the defendant has not been negligent, he will be held liable. Okay, so this is how Blackburn J, try to remember the name of the judge also. Blackburn J founded the rule of strict liability, that even if you are not negligent, you will be held liable, because there is no fault of yours, but there are certain reasons because of which you will be held liable. Now, what are these reasons? Blackburn J, in his judgment, told us. He said that we think that the rule of law is that a person who for his own purpose brings on his land and keeps there anything likely to do mischief, if it escapes, he must keep it in at his peril. If he does not do so, is prima facie answerable for all the damages which is the natural consequence of its escape. Now, what Blackburn J is trying to say, see, if you are bringing anything in your property or on your property, okay, if you are bringing anything on your property and that particular thing escapes, so you should be liable for that. This is what Blackburn J is trying to say. Okay, so if you are bringing anything on your land, okay, and if it escapes and it will lead to mischief, in this case it has led to mischief, okay, mischief because it caused loss to the plaintiff. Okay, so you will be liable for or answerable for all the damages, okay, which are the natural result of that particular escape. Now, there are certain excuses also which the defendant can show. So these are the exceptions of which Blackburn J is talking about. He says that you have to show that the escape was owing to the plaintiff's default, okay, or it was act of God, vis major. But as nothing of this sort exists here, in this particular case, he's talking about this particular case, Ryland versus Fletcher, that in this case there is no plaintiff's default, there is no act of God, then we will not inquire into those and the defendant will be held liable. Yes, we agree that the defendant was not negligent. We agree that defendant did not had any bad intention, but still he will be held liable because the rule is no fault liability. Now, there are three essential ingredients for this particular rule to apply. And you have to remember these three essentials because these are the basis of rule of strict liability as well as the rule of absolute liability. The basic difference between strict liability and absolute liability is, first you have to ensure that a particular case falls into strict liability. See, suppose this is a case, you have to check that it falls in strict liability or not. Then you have to check that it falls under any of the exception. If it falls under any of the exception of the case, then this is the defendant will not be held liable. But what happens in absolute liability, even if the case falls under any of the exceptions, then also you will be held liable. So absolute liability is strict liability minus exceptions. Okay, so if we exclude the exceptions which are provided in strict liability, we will form we will get the absolute liability. So in absolute liability there are no exceptions. So for both, for strict liability, for absolute liability, for both you have to prove these three essentials. Now, what are these three essentials? First essential condition is that on your property, on your land, you brought some dangerous thing. Okay, so you brought some dangerous thing on your property, okay, by a person on his own land. Okay, so the defendant, the owner of the land, the person having the possession of the land himself brings something on his land, something which is dangerous. Okay, Second thing which you have to prove as a prosecution for bringing the charges or bringing someone under strict liability, you have to show that the thing which the defendant brought was